the decks for action. The time for speech is past. And do the job we have to do and get it over fast. Let's put the axe to the axis. Let 'em know that their show is all through. Oh, let's put the axe to the axis. Lend a hand to the land we love true. With all our might, we'll fight, because we know we're right. And then, again, the future will be bright. So let's put the axe to the axis and finish up the trouble they began. The axe to the axis. Try a can to Japan and the rest. Oh, let's get real nasty to Nazis. Italy will soon see that we're best. There is no doubt about the fact we'll never stop until we will, like always, land on top. So let's put the axe to the axis and teach them not to pick on a process. The decks for action, the time for speech is past, and do the job we have to do and get it over fast. Let's put the axe to the axis, let 'em know that their show is all through. Oh, let's put the axe to the axis, lend a hand to the land we love true. With all our might, we'll fight, because we know we're right. And then, again, the future will be bright. So let's put the axe to the axis and finish up the trouble they began. The axe to the axis, try a can to Japan and the rest. Oh, let's get real nasty to Nazis. Italy will soon see that we're best. There is no doubt about the fact we'll never stop until we will, like always, land on top. So let's put the axe to the axis and teach them not to pick on a process. decks for action. The time for speech is past. And do the job we have to do and get it over fast. Let's put the axe to the axis. Let 'em know that their show is all through. Oh, let's put the axe to the axis. Lend a hand to the land we love true. With all our might, we'll fight, because we know we're right. And then, again, the future will be bright. So let's put the axe to the axis and finish up the trouble they began. The axe to the axis. Try a can to Japan and the rest. Oh, let's get real nasty to Nazis. Italy will soon see that we're best. There is no doubt about the fact we'll never stop until we will, like always, land on top. So let's put the axe to the axis and teach them not to pick on Uncle Sam. Decks for action, the time for speech is past, and do the job we have to do and get it over fast. Let's put the axe to the axis, let 'em know that their show is all through. Oh, let's put the axe to the axis, lend a hand to the land we love true. With all our might, we'll fight, because we know we're right. And then, again, the future will be bright. So let's put the axe to the axis and finish up the trouble they began.
Hello world! Yes, we are live. Well, let's see who we've got online. We got the Tanks of World War II, Tank and AFV News. Is that Walter? Let's see who else we got. Tumber E23. Oh, Ricky is around. Ricky Palacios, you're always a reliable chap. Greetings to all. Yes, welcome back to another fun-filled and exciting adventure of the Chieftain's Armored Vehicle Society. The Chieftain, of course, being me. And last time we had a video. We watched T34, the movie, together, which was a bit good laugh, but not exactly serious. And so we are going to go back to the idea of getting a well-regarded book by a well-regarded author and reading the book ahead of time, thinking about it, and unlike most book clubs, we're getting the author. So it is with great pleasure I will return to the world of Tanks. It's been absent for a while. Mr. Stephen Zaloga coming to us live from Maryland. Whoosh.
Almost an Aberdeen proving ground.
Almost. Not that there is much left there.
Oh, there's a lot left. Not much in the way of historical stuff, but there's a lot of boom boom every day. Sounds like World War II out my window.
There's something similar to that here, actually, Camp Bulis. Okay, so a couple of random questions then. We're going to give a couple of seconds before we really get into the meat of the book for a couple of other lads to show up. But my first question to you is, what is it with you and Marmon Harrington's?
Oh, years ago, I was talking to one of my editors, and they said, "Oh, you always write about these great tanks, Shermans or T34s or stuff like that. But what is the worst tank?" And I thought, well, I didn't want to, do world's worst tanks because you have some real stinkers out there. But I thought, oh, okay, what's the worst U.S. Army tank of World War II? And quite honestly, it was an easy choice. It was the Marmon Harrington. It was just a dreadful, totally crappy tank. And but I had to sort of prove it, so I did some research and came up with an article. And it was such a bad tank that Australia in 1942, when Australia is desperate for tanks, they got about 100 Marmon Harrington tanks. They took them apart, took the engines out, put the engines in landing craft, and threw away the rest. Now, what does that tell you about the quality of that as a tank?
It is one of the few tanks that was developed outside of Ordnance Branch.
It was a truck company, and what basically happened was that the U.S. Army was not willing to sell tanks overseas. If we keep in mind what time we're talking about, 1940-41, it's before the United States enters the war. U.S. tank production in the 1930s was tiny. The U.S. knows it's going to get dragged into war, so there's this big effort to get Rock Island Arsenal and the tank production facilities geared up. So the U.S. Army doesn't want to sell tanks to anybody. They want to get tanks for the U.S. Army because the U.S. Army has so few tanks. Well, Marmon Harrington is basically a truck company that had built up its business exporting military trucks. And some genius there thought, well, we build trucks, why don't we build tanks? In spite of the fact, of course, there's a world of difference between trucks and tanks. And so they started coming up with really awful little tankettes that they sold to the Marine Corps. The only reason the Marine Corps bought them is they were so tiny they could stick them on landing craft. And then finally they came up with a family of these little two-man tanks. And they convinced some very, very desperate buyers like the Dutch and the Chinese, oh, okay, we can't buy tanks from anywhere, but we really, really need tanks. We'll buy your junk. And so the Dutch East Indies put in a big, big order for several hundred Marmon Harrington tanks. And of course, the Japanese conquered the Dutch East Indies before very many of them were delivered, so they got dumped on the U.S. Army. And even the U.S. Army knew they stunk, so they sent them to the Aleutians and in Newfoundland and in Nova Scotia and other hot spots of world battlefields. And the only thing that can be said about it is it came very close to being the only U.S. tank that almost fought a foreign tank on U.S. soil. That being in the Aleutians, because the Japanese landed 2 Type 95s in the Aleutians. But thank goodness for both sides, they never came into contact.
The least worst tank wins.
Yeah, exactly.
But you always struck me as having a secret love for Marmon Harringtons. Okay, so the other question I had has actually slipped my mind. So we will just go right on into the story of Armored Champion, which is a little different, I think, from most of your previous books. I got Armored from the Vault on the Shelf and whatever, which is really in-depth. You've kind of come up with a balance here between a lot of in-depth tables to prove a point. Yet it's also very light reading, and it seems to be targeted towards more of the enthusiastic amateur crowd.
That's exactly who the audience was, and how it started, quite honestly, is, and I'm sure you're in the same boat that I am, you're sitting around a bar, talking with friends, and it's like, what's the world's worst tank? What's the world's best tank? Blah, blah, blah. You have those conversations all the time. And it's always difficult to have that conversation because you don't know what level you're talking to. I mean, when I'm with some friends, I know they really know tanks. But then other times I'm over at a hobby show or something, and it's a bunch of aircraft nuts, and, they know something about tanks. They're not completely ignorant, but they're not really well-versed in it. And one time I was talking to one of my acquisition editors, and we got talking about that. He was saying that he was somewhere, and somebody said, oh, what's the best tank World War II? And so then it became obvious. It would make a good subject for a book. But you can't. The first thing I said to him is that from all these bar hall conversations that I had, the real answer is that there is no one best tank. And so the book got sort of stretched out by trying to define what the best tank is, as well as one of my main points being that there's different best tanks at different times in World War II. If you're talking 1939, the invasion of Poland, the best tank at that point in the war is one thing. But if you're talking the Battle of Berlin in May 1945, the best tank is going to be something else. So that extended the conversation. It gives it a time frame. So when I did the book, I broke it into various groups. They're not necessarily year by year. They're more eras that I broke it into. And the other thing that I did is I tried to define who is judging best tank. And what I tried to do is make the argument that best tank can be judged from two viewpoints. One of the viewpoints, and the most obvious, probably what everybody thinks of, especially people who play World of Tanks, is the tanker's viewpoint. You know, if you're out there on the battlefield, what tank do you want? You know, what is the best tank from your standpoint? And that's fine because, you know, that's the point of view of World of Tanks. So I call that the tanker's choice. That's a view that probably leans more heavily towards firepower and protection. You want a really big gun. You want really good protection. You want to sort of be Michael Wittmann. You want to be the Tiger Ace. You want to have a great tank facing a bunch of Shermans. You don't want to be sitting in a tankette facing a Tiger tank. So from that perspective, I call it tanker's choice. But my other perspective, and the perspective I use is kind of put on my hat as a professional historian, is armies don't win wars based on what the tankers want. There's other criteria that come to the fore, and so I call that the commander's choice. If you're Dwight Eisenhower or Heinz Guderian or Georgy Zhukov, what tank do you want out there as far as your best tank? And the criteria there is different. You're not necessarily going to want a Tiger tank because you know that you can only buy a certain number of them. You've got a limited budget. Everybody has a limited budget. Tigers are expensive. You probably want a lot of tanks. You don't want a lot of really, really terrible tanks. You've got to come to some balance. You've got to have a balance between quality and quantity. And so when I did the best tanks, I did it in two general headings. Tanker's choice, sort of probably more from the point of view of the World of Tanks fans, and commander's choice. If you're a senior commander, what do you want? What do you want your army to be equipped with? So I did it by those two criteria.
I think there's probably two additional things. That one is whether or not even the doctrine for the tank is the same. I mean, if you're just comparing a commander's choice, for example, you're assuming that each commander wants the tank to do the same thing. But just because you have an entirely different doctrine with the tanks configured for that different doctrine doesn't mean it's a bad tank to fit the role. So one of the things I always like to point out is I'm sure you're more than familiar with the battle at Gembloux Gap, where the French tanks were pretty horrible, but they were designed to work in conjunction with ridiculous amounts of artillery. And when the Germans came along, they ran into this ridiculous amount of artillery supported by tanks, and they came to a screeching halt for 3 days, or however long it was.
Yeah, and that's the other issue is that especially at the beginning of World War II in 1939, 1940, most armies had a variety of tank classifications. There wasn't simply, today when we think of tanks, we think of, main battle tanks. We have the Abrams and the T-90 and the Challenger and the Leopard 2. But in 1939, most armies had multiple types of tanks. So they would have something called a tankette, or they had other names for it. Then you'd have something called, for example, in the British case, a cruiser tank. In the Russian case, it was called a fast tank. In the American case, you had cavalry tanks versus infantry tanks or light tanks. And so how do you make the judgment there? Because the tanks are supposed to satisfy different roles. Can you judge a light tank against a cavalry tank, even though they're both designed for different roles? And quite honestly, when I was doing this book, I hate to say it, but I had to kind of compromise and aim for sort of a middle ground, sort of pretend that the universal tank, the forerunner of the main battle tank existed in 1939 and 1940. So I skipped all the fringe stuff. In none of the cases did I judge things like tankettes. I tended to lean more towards the more heavily armored, more heavily armed tanks and the lighter, more cavalry-ish tanks, even though some of the winners were, in fact, cavalry tanks. I mean, most people don't realize it, but the T34 started out as a cavalry tank. So, yeah, that's definitely, it's both doctrine and it's also strongly connected to doctrine, the classification of tanks and the varying classifications through time.
Okay. So as I'm flicking through the book here, which of course I have in front of me, I mean, you might one of the other things that that you make mention here, as I'm looking at this particular page, for example, is crew configuration, which again, I don't think people put enough emphasis on. And if I look at Panzer tracks up on the shelf behind me, I look at the list of requirements for the Panzer III, and the first 2 or 3 requirements were not related to the gun or the armor. It was, the first one was radius of action, the second one was crew configuration, and I think third came mobility, fourth was the gun, and then armor was this little thing at the very bottom.
The crew configuration was very important for the Germans, and quite honestly, they were the innovators in this field. They were the first ones who really understood how important the 3-man turret crew was. And the strange thing is, this stems from early Soviet-German cooperation in the late 1920s. That's oftentimes not appreciated, but in the late 1920s, both the Germans and the Soviet Union were kind of outcasts, and the Germans weren't supposed to be able to have tanks. The Versailles Treaty at the end of World War I said, you can't have tanks. And the Soviet Union was ostracized because of the Bolshevik government and all that stuff. So they got together and they set up a tank facility called the Kama facility in South Central Russia, and they tested out tanks. The Germans brought some of their new experimental tanks there, and the Russians brought some of their own tanks, as well as stuff they bought from Britain, such as the Vickers tank and that sort of thing. And one of the first lessons that the Germans had from the tests at the Kama test ranges is they tested out a tank that had a 3-man crew. And they found that this had all sorts of advantages. The most critical one is that it freed up the commander to control his tank and to coordinate his tank with the other tanks in the unit. Prior to that, a lot of tanks would have, if they had a turret, for example, the first turreted or first common turreted tank, the Reno FT, you had one person in the turret. So he had to do everything. He had to load the gun, aim the gun, coordinate his tank with neighboring tanks. He was overwhelmed. So a lot of other armies said, well, one man's not good enough. We should have 2. So you would typically have a commander who also loaded the gun, and then you'd have a dedicated gunner. And that worked okay. I mean, there's plenty of examples of that. The Stuart tank of World War II, the Panzer 38T, there's a lot of 2-man tanks. But the Germans early on got used to this idea, 3 is the ideal. And I would argue that that's one of the keys to the early German Blitzkrieg victories, that they understood that tanks aren't simply firepower, mobility, and armor, that command and control is an essential element. And that when you're on a battlefield with a tank, if you've got better situational awareness because you have that independent commander, you're going to prevail on the battlefield. And I would argue that's one of the reasons that the Germans do so well against the French in 1940. That the French tanks tended to have 1-man or 2-man turrets. The Germans, by that stage, with the exception, obviously, of the very light pre-war tanks, the Panzer I, the Panzer II, they're, for lack of a better term, main battle tanks. The Panzer III, Panzer IV, they have 3-man turrets. And that's an absolutely critical innovation.
So you have a couple of tanks that you rate on the basis of crew quality. Which I wonder if that's not doing a partial disservice to the tanks. For example, later on you talk about the Panther, how it became less than ideal because the crews didn't know how to use it. There's two arguments to that. One is that's not the tank's fault. The other argument is if you know that you don't have a well-trained crew base, you need to design a tank that's easier to use, such as the automatic transmissions on later American tanks were much easier to train to drive.
The problem I had with the book is that you're trying to use so many criteria to judge things, and one of the points that I made in the book is that a lot of my nominations for best tank, I can argue other choices. I just threw some names down because I had to come up with a list of best tanks. So yeah, you can argue it from the standpoint of, should you be arguing it from strictly the technical aspects of the tank, or the tank within the context of the army that it's fighting with? And being more on the historian side than on the World of Tanks side, I wanted to come down a little bit more heavily on, did these tanks fit the army that were fighting with them? The U.S. Army with the Sherman tank is going to fight different than a Sherman tank in the Soviet Army. A Panther tank in the hands of the very experienced crews of 1943 is going to perform differently than a Panther tank in the hands of unskilled, inexperienced, poorly trained crews from 1945. So those factors do come into play. There's any number of criteria that you can use to judge them.
Yeah.
What I try to do in the book is basically to throw a lot of this stuff down on the ground, throw a lot of the data, throw a lot of this stuff on the ground and say, well, here's my choice. But, from the reader's standpoint, you don't have to agree with these viewpoints. Pick your own choice. And that's what I tried to do in the book. I actually wanted to provide enough information that people could make educated assessments on their own. I had to throw down something on my own, but at the same time, I wanted to leave readers free to feel that they could come up with a perfectly suitable argument for another choice.
I don't know if you caught it, but the Tank Museum in Bovington, they released a video today with Al Murray for his top 5 tanks, or his bottom 5 tanks, and he chose exactly the same tanks as he chose for his top 5 deliberately to show that you can make arguments for and against exactly the same vehicle.
Yeah, I haven't seen that, but yeah, I can see the point.
All right, so we're going to go on then. I like the way you put all the costs of all these tanks. We're going to go on to chapter 1, which is the interwar period. Now, lads in the audience, we're going to pause at the end of chapter 1 when we start talking about the interwar period, and you can kick over any questions you have about the interwar tank design. I mean, it is really the era of the tankette, and the tankette versus the Mark VI Vickers versus the Christie. I think it's really your 3 major contenders.
And actually, in that period, the first chapter, I actually didn't do a choice. The first chapter I did simply to kind of establish where World War II comes from. Where do tanks come from? Obviously, they come from the First World War. What was happening in the 1920s? The 1920s is really a period where it's mostly the doldrums. The big armies, France, Britain, United States, Soviet Union, they have a lot of leftover stuff from World War I. So in practically all these cases, it's the Reno FT or some variety of that. The US built copies, Italy built its own copy, the Russians built copies. It's only towards the late 1920s that people start building new stuff. And of course, what happens in the early 1930s, you have the Depression come along, the armies don't have any money. So you have a lot of really junky designs come along. You have the British concept of tankettes, which catches on big time because a lot of the armies in the poorer countries look at tankettes and say, yeah, they're cheap, we can buy a lot of them. So you get things like the L333 in Italy, you get the TKS in Poland, you get the T-27 in the Soviet Union. These are really, really poor tanks. You get some interesting designs. Britain certainly is amongst the more adventurous countries. So you get everything running from tankettes, the Cardinal A tankettes, up through super monster battleship tanks like the Independent, to sort of clunky mid-range tanks like the medium tanks that they design. In the United States, you see other trends. The United States looks at Britain and picks out one tank in particular, the Vickers 6-ton, as do many other armies, and say, Vickers 6-ton, that's a pretty good idea. We don't want to license produce it, so Rock Island starts up this family of tanks which defines American tank design. There's a guy by the name of Harry Knox out there, and he comes up with vertical volute suspension, a particular type of track, all of which is somewhat derived off the Vickers 6-ton, and it becomes basically the Stuart and its predecessors in the combat cars and light tanks. You see the same thing everywhere else. The most widely produced tank of the 1930s is the Russian T-26, which is a licensed-produced copy of the Vickers 6-ton. In Poland, you see the 7TP. In Italy, you see the M11, and then you see the M1340, which are basically Italian copies of the 6-ton. So I would argue that for the pre-Spanish Civil War period, because I divide it pre-Spanish Civil War and post-Spanish Civil War, the Vickers 6-ton is...
You have the Roaring 30s up to 1936.
Yeah, I have the Roaring 30s. The Roaring 30s I throw in basically the period from about 1936, Spanish Civil War, up to the start of actual World War II, so September 1939. And so I take a look at a little bit into the later period. What happens in 1934, 1935 is Germany starts militarizing. Adolf Hitler comes into power, the Nazis come to power, Mussolini comes to power in Italy. Well, Mussolini had been in power for a while. There's wars starting in the Pacific, in China. The militarization of Germany starts Britain and France and Czechoslovakia and Poland all starting to build tanks big time. If you go up to about 1935, 1936, nobody's building tanks. They're building them in very small numbers, dozens a year. So two things are happening: militarization of Germany and this whole, lead up to war. And then you suddenly have an event which gets everybody thinking about what they need in the way of tanks. That's Spanish Civil War, starts in 1936. You have the Germans and the Italians supporting the nationalists. You have the Soviet Union supporting the Republicans, and also you have France and Britain sort of supporting the Republicans, although not actually giving them any equipment. And so now you start to have some actual tank combat, the first serious large-scale tank combat since World War I. And the second event, of course, is that you start seeing tank versus tank combat. If you remember in World War I, there's only one instance where a tank fights another tank. An A-7V fights a Mark IV at one point. But tank versus tank fighting is almost entirely unheard of. And then the Spanish Civil War comes along, and tank versus tank combat is actually fairly common. So people are starting to think, well, maybe tanks aren't just infantry support weapons. Maybe we've got to start thinking about tanks as having to fight other tanks. So Spanish Civil War is a seminal event in tank development, and it happens to coincide when Europe is starting to militarize again because everybody's starting to see the war clouds.
So one of the vehicles in this period, of course, is the BT and the Christie tanks, and it's one of the great internet arguments. Were the Americans idiots to refuse the Christie tank and to go their own way with volley suspension?
Oh, we could do an entire program on that. Part of the problem is the Christie tank is really an awful tank. I would argue that the Christie tank is a real stinker. That the U.S. Army, if they had gone in the direction of a tank with a Christie suspension, and let me emphasize that point, tank with a Christie suspension, not a Christie tank, tank with a Christie suspension. As you know, the first Christies, that first batch they bought, the Army hated because they were too narrow. Walter Christie did not develop a tank. He developed a suspension system. And so the Army went out to bids, and Christie lost the second bid, and other firms came in and developed Christie-derived tanks. They had Christie suspensions, but they had wider hulls and bigger turrets, and the Army liked those. The only reason that they didn't buy them at that period, even though they liked them better than the Stuart predecessors, was they were more expensive, and the U.S. Army in 1936 had no money, so they didn't buy them. So my answer would be, if the Great Depression didn't happen and the U.S. Army had money, the U.S. Army would have had something that looked very much like the predecessors of the T34 in 1940. But for largely monetary reasons, because of the Great Depression, they didn't. And there's some very clear American pre-T34 tanks. And unfortunately, they weren't built in any kind of quantity. Instead, it became the Stuart line, a parallel line. They used an entirely different type of suspension, and that's history.
In fairness, I don't think the Army were too pleased with the amount of room that the suspension took inside the tank either.
Nor did anybody else. The Russians realized that themselves. I mean, if you look at what happens with the Russians, they do build large numbers of Christie copies, the BT family, BT2 up through BT7. But by the late 1930s, they're thinking the same thing the U.S. Army's thinking. The hull is too narrow. There's no space in there for the turret crew. It's got to be widened up. And that's what results in the A-20, and then the A-20 eventually evolves into T-34. The U.S. Army was already moving in the same direction. The U.S. Army had an equivalent of A-20, but they didn't make the next step because they never, for a variety of reasons, they were working in the other direction, the designs coming out of Rock Island Arsenal.
So the other vehicle you mentioned for the 30s, and I have to salute you for picking it because I think it is a very underrated tank, or one that everybody forgets about, is the T28, with its three-man crew, electric traverse with a full turret basket. It was reasonably fast.
It was a very sophisticated tank, and it's strange in that it's one of the few truly Russian tanks, because the Soviet Union builds more tanks than the rest of the world combined in the 1930s. They build about 25,000 tanks. Compared to the rest of the world, the U.S. had built maybe 1,000. The Germans built a couple thousand. The French a couple thousand. But the Russian tanks are the T-26, which is a copy of the Vickers 6-ton with a better turret. They build the BT, which is a better version of the Christie. They build the T-35, which is basically a version of the British Independent. But the one tank that they come up with that's sort of their own, I mean, you can see British influences from the Independent with the little sub-turrets, but T-28 is pretty much their own tank. And it's a pretty good design. It's a medium tank. It's got a decent gun, got a decent crew. It can do a variety of things. You can use it as an infantry tank. It's got decent mobility. It's got a big enough engine that it's reasonably fast. It's got decent armor for the time. The only reason it doesn't see more service is that it was expensive. It's a fairly sophisticated tank for the 1930s, and even in the Soviet case, they couldn't build that many. But it's the one that I picked as tanker's choice for the Roaring 30s because I thought, if you're sitting there, it has better armor and better firepower than the lighter tanks, the T-26 type things, the BTs, that sort of thing. And the German tanks, I didn't want to consider Panzer III, but the German tanks, the period, Panzer I, Panzer II, no, they were bought simply because Germany had to start building something. And so they picked those, and they admitted as much. I mean, the Germans viewed these as being a way to get their industry started. They did not view them as ideal. And once Spain happens, they suddenly realize, no, these are really bad designs. So they keep them in service, but they're not wonderful.
Okay, so before we move on to the Blitzkrieg tanks, a couple of questions from the audience. Another very popular one, the impact of Guderian being a wireless officer on German panzer development. I mean, I know this came up in Operation Think Tank. I've talked with Ralph Ratz at the Panzer Museum about it. Guderian his influence has been overstated, perhaps, except with regards to the radio.
Let's go back and look at who first puts radios in tanks. Britain, France. There's no radio in the A7V. There were plans to put a radio in the A7V, but it never happened. But the British have tank radios in World War I. The French have radios in their tanks in World War I. The U.S. Army has, because they have French tanks, have radios in their tanks in the 1920s. Early American tanks have radios. French tanks all through this period have radios. Now, I think that one of the mistakes is that everybody thinks, oh, yeah, all German tanks had radios, but the other people like the British and the French or the Russians only had radios in a few tanks. And actually, the Germans had radios much the same way that the Soviet Union or the French had it. They have transceivers, that is to say, radios that can transmit and receive in commanders' tanks, platoon commanders' tanks, or company commanders' tanks, and they only have receivers in all the rest of the tanks. And that's the common practice through most European tanks during this period. So you have the squad leader or the platoon leader, or the company leader has a transceiver, transmitter, receiver, and everybody else just gets receivers. So Germany was not that much further in advance. You can maybe make some arguments, well, maybe the radios were better, but and some armies didn't have anything at all. The French, for example, with their infantry tanks, until 1940 itself, their infantry tanks pretty much don't have either transceivers or receivers. Although their cavalry tanks do, their battle tanks do. So it's a more complicated situation than people suggest. And the Russians had lots of radios. If you go and look at the number of T-26s and BTs that were built, lots of them have radios.
Richard Herndon, the first time you heard a tank versus tank started in the Spanish Civil War. It was like T-26s with the 45s versus Panzer Is with an 8mm. That did not go well for the Panzer Is.
Strangely enough, the first battle was between a number of T-26s and Italian L3 tankettes. And the T-26s literally rammed and pushed the L3s off the road, which convinced everybody, yeah, tankettes are not a great idea. There were a number of engagements between T-26 and Panzer Is. The Panzer Is came off very badly because they're obviously only armed with machine guns. But it was a mixed bag. There were all sorts of things fighting all sorts of other things.
When did the British Mark 19 come out? The wireless? I would have to think about 1942 or so, but I would need to check that up. And J. Jono, I love the Sharbie, and somewhat, but not sure if they were built pre-World War II. I always considered, we're going to move it to the Blitzkrieg tanks now.
Yeah.
I've always considered the Sharbie 1 bis to be the best tank from the 1920s that saw service in World War II.
Oh, very much so, because it actually is. It was developed to fight the Battle of 1919. If you go back and you look at the French Army requirements, it's basically a World War I tank. In fact, what the French were doing is they took a look at the British rhomboid designs, the Mark IV and tanks like that, and said those are really good for trench crossing. And then they looked at their own Renault FT and they said, well, it has the advantage of the turret, but we would like better trench crossing like the British tanks. And what's the Sharbie? The Sharbie is a British Mark IV tank with a Renault turret stuck up on the top of it. And obviously from 1919, 1920, yeah, okay, it gets better than that. But that's how it starts. If you look at pictures of the prototype Sharbies from 1920, 21, 22, it looks like a Mark IV with a little dinky Renault turret stuck up on the top of it.
Of course, yeah, we don't give the little two-man turrets, two-man tanks very much time. I mean, again, these are tanks that were designed to fit a role, but they kind of sucked as overall tanks as we would know it today. But then everybody loves the Somme. Well, most everybody. I was kind of 50-50 on it personally.
I think the Somme was good from a variety of standpoints. The reason I always like Somme is people don't stop to think about it, but the Somme was actually the predecessor of the Sherman. And that may seem like a weird comparison to make, but what most people don't realize is that in 1939, 1940, the French government came to the United States and said, we want you to license build French tanks in the United States. And they actually shipped over to Aberdeen Proving Grounds a full set of manufacturing plans for the Hotchkiss 39, for the Somme, and for the Sharbie. And the one tank that the U.S. really appreciated was the Somme, because the U.S. looked at it and said, oh, we've been using all this welded plate. But the French have this idea of casting, and casting, maybe we could do things faster. And so if you go and look at the Somme and forget the hull width and see things like the cast turret and the cast hull, and you look at the M4A1 Sherman, the initial Sherman, the cast hull Sherman, they look an awful lot alike. The Sherman obviously is wider, has a bigger turret ring, bigger turret, but there's a very strong influence between the Somme 35 and the Sherman, and there's a real reason for it. Sitting somewhere in the archives, never found them. I know that somewhere in the U.S. archives there's a full set manufacturing plans for the Somme, but I just haven't found them yet.
What are you going to do with them when you do find them?
Well, I already have the French version, so I don't really need them. It's pure curiosity. I'll tell you another story. It's the same thing. In fact, I've had some French friends of mine say, when you're digging in the archives, look for it. The French are convinced that the American bazooka stems from a French engineer who developed a rocket-propelled anti-tank grenade. And I know it's true. I mean, I know that the U.S. was influenced by this particular anti-tank grenade design that preceded the bazooka. But once again, I haven't been able to find the paperwork. I mean, I know that the U.S. got the design. I know that they looked at it, but I haven't been able to track down the actual paper trail proving that the U.S. borrowed this idea as the predecessor for the bazooka.
All right, so somewhere, okay, if there was any reasonable tank from the French side, we're going to go with the Somme for that one, even though, I mean, it was a bit limited with a three-man crew, and the radio men half the time didn't have a radio. So all he was doing, he's kind of just here, have a round of ammo.
The Somme, interestingly enough, everybody assumes that the Somme was a one-man, or has a one-man turret like the Sharbie, because they look at the turrets, they all appear to be almost identical. When in fact the Somme had a larger turret ring. The upper casting is almost identical. But the Somme had a larger turret ring, and it was what the French called a crew and a half turret. And the radio operator was supposed to act as the loader. They put in the larger turret ring specifically to give him enough space that he could sort of get from the shoulder up into the turret, and to assist the commander by loading the gun. So it's a little bit misunderstood in that respect. The real problem with the Samwa is the French put weight requirements on the Samwa, as a lot of armies did back then. A lot of armies did weight restrictions because of tactical bridging and that sort of thing. And Samwa had weight limitations, which forced them to go to what they considered to be too narrow a tank. Partly for bridging, partly for other reasons, partly to keep the weight down. If they had been given a more free hand, it probably would have looked more like an M41 Sherman.
Ricky points out that the Sharbie is a pretty big tank, but they were really designed for different purposes. I mean, the DLMs for the Sommers, they were basically they were Panzer divisions. They were mobile things, as opposed to the Sharbie, which is more of a not even a breakthrough, it's an infantry support tank.
Yeah, the Sharbie is something of a it doesn't fit very well because it wasn't developed alongside French. Well, it was modified to fit French doctrine. When it was developed in the early 1920s, the basic layout, this very much British Mark IV rhomboid chassis with a turret up on the top and then a gun stuck in the front rather than having sponsons, that very much fits the World War I infantry support role. You just want this to kind of slowly crawl along with your infantry and attack targets. But then by the late 1920s, early 1930s, the French are starting to think of tanks in a more broad sense. And they eventually come up with this idea of the battle tank. And so they try to twist the Sharbie to fit that. So, you know, they throw in a radio, they throw in an anti-tank gun in the turret. Instead of having a little short, basically infantry support gun up in the turret, they throw in an anti-tank gun to engage enemy tanks. So it's kind of a hybrid. It was developed for an entirely different doctrine, and then it's kind of twisted to fit the French doctrine that's emerging in the late 1930s, and it was never a very happy fit. It's not. It was not a very successful design for that reason.
Thumbprint's an interesting question. Where did the Somwa in the U.S. Army collection come from? I think it's in Aberdeen. No, it's in Fort Lee now, I think.
It comes from Italy, strangely enough. What happened is in 1940, after the end of the French campaign, the Germans obviously absorbed large numbers of French tanks into their own service. Everybody knows that. Plenty of pictures of the Wehrmacht using, Hotchkisses and Reynos and Sharbies and Samwas and that sort of thing, usually in secondary roles, any partisan warfare or, but they're even in Normandy in, 1944. I mean, there's fighting against French tanks in German service. But the Italians get into the 1940 campaign a little bit on the late side, and French tanks, by Italian standards, are pretty good. The Italians in 1940 don't have anything comparable to Sharbie or to Samwa, or even to things like the Reyno R35. Well, so they go to the Germans and say, please, can we have some of those nice French tanks? And so the Germans say, well, you can't have any Sharbies because we like those. We're going to use Sharbies. So the Germans give them mainly Reyno 35s. The Italians get about 2 battalions of R35s, and they base the U.S. Army on Sicily. And in fact, the Aberdeen R35 is an ex-Italian R35 from Sicily. They also give them a relatively small number of Samwas. I don't remember the exact number, but I think it's maybe a company or maybe 2 companies worth. And they're mostly deployed up north. I think the unit may have been either on Corsica or Sardinia. They did not serve down in Sicily, and they didn't serve in central Italy. But there was one tank left behind at one of the Italian test centers in Rome. And I don't know why the U.S. brought it back, but the U.S. Army, when they captured Rome, they found this particular tank in the Italian tank center, and they said, "Oh, this looks cool." And they shipped it back. So it actually came back, though it did not have Italian markings. The Reyno that was sent back was in the markings of the Italian tank battalion from Sicily. The Samwa, if you see really, really old color slides of the Samwa that was sent back from Rome, it's still in French camouflage markings. In fact, you can identify the French unit it comes from. So it was just used for test and evaluation. It was never put into Italian service.
That was a more detailed answer than I bet you were expecting. Kudos.
Well, having spent a lot of time, having spent a lot, I live right next to Aberdeen Proving Grounds. Having spent much time over in Aberdeen, I've climbed over that. I like French tanks. I've written quite a few books on French tanks from various periods, and I've always thought the Sun was kind of cool. So I've really looked into that one.
Comment from Jay Jono, the guy in the Sharbie, the butcher of Stun, which of course is Dumarc, and everybody talks about him and Bilot. Oh, this is an example of how great the Sharbie was, because like he went into Bilot, went into Stun. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, hang on a second. Bilot was a company commander. He was supposed to be leading 7 tanks, but he went in on his own. Why? And it's because he couldn't command his tank because he had such a crappy tank.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a Michael Wittmann moment. It's, if you look at Valery Bocage, it's the same thing. Michael Wittmann isn't doing what he's supposed to do and leading his unit in. He's going in single-handedly and blasting away at the British tanks and blowing them all up. And the same thing happened in the Battle for Sun. It was not, it's not an example of sophisticated tactics. It was just that, under the circumstances, he just felt, this is the thing to do, and he goes in and slaughters a whole bunch of German tanks. And I actually did a book in the Osprey Duel series where that's the centerpiece of the book, that particular duel between that particular Sharbie and the Battle of Stun. And yeah, it's not typical of the 1940 campaign by any stretch of the imagination, but it does cast a different light on the potential of a tank in the right circumstances.
Okay, so before we get too into the weeds here, because and we've got a whole war to do and an hour and 10 to do it, unless we did split this up into 2 parts, maybe we'll just do that. The British cruisers, again, I think are a little bit underrated because they've got a lot of the modern benefits. They have a rear drive, they have a 3-man turret, they got a pretty reasonable gun, and they always viewed their turreted gun to be an anti-tank gun primarily, as opposed to most other, like the Americans just had machine guns everywhere. And unfortunately, not really up to par in 1940. But
one of the reasons, I didn't rate them very highly in the book, and it has to do with circumstance as much as the design. Part of the problem is in 1940 they're insignificant. A small number of cruiser tanks do get over to France. They don't see a lot of combat. What combat they see is not particularly happy. So it's kind of hard to evaluate them. When you're dealing with a few dozen tanks compared to hundreds of Sharbies and Samas. So I kind of ignored them in the Blitzkrieg era for that reason. I didn't really spend a lot of time with the Desert Campaign. And the reason is, quite honestly, is that from an American-British perspective, from an English language perspective, there's way too much focus on it. By the time that campaign's happening in 1940-41, there's other stuff happening elsewhere. One single word, Russia. And so from the standpoint of the scale of tank combat, the Desert Campaign just isn't that important. I don't think it's very important from the technological standpoint. It's, there's not that much innovation that comes out of anything due to the desert. By that stage, the innovation's all happening because of the Eastern Front, because of the Russian front. And so I didn't pay a lot of attention. I didn't pay any attention, quite honestly, either to the British infantry tanks. There's things to be said about the Matilda II, and it has not so much to do with the Matilda II. It's just that the way that things settle, numerically, they're not that significant. They don't take part in that many significant campaigns, that many battles. They get overwhelmed by what's happening elsewhere. So it's not that I want to give them short limitations
as well. I mean, would the British have won the North African campaign if they had no cruisers and only had Matilda IIs? And probably not. They would have been completely outmaneuvered.
Right. And then you can make arguments, later on, the importance of, Crusader versus Valentine. What if the British Army had been more sympathetic to Vickers and had bought 6-ton tanks and then, later on bought more Valentines versus Crusaders? I mean, there's something to be said for the commercial experience of the Vickers firm. Why didn't the British Army buy these very successful 6-ton tanks, and why didn't they go and prefer the Valentine over the Crusaders? So yeah, there's a lot of arguments that can be made, and I've stayed away from them for, as I say, for numbers count, and those numbers just don't count.
Okay,
and they're well covered elsewhere. It's not as though there's a shortage of books dealing with that subject.
All right, so we move on then to the German side. It's down to the Panzer III versus the Panzer IV. I personally think that the Panzer III is one of the most criminally underrated vehicles ever seen combat in World War II. But you picked the Panzer IV, which I can understand why you picked that as well.
The reason I picked it for 1940, one word: transmission. The early Panzer III was an excellent tank, but it had a crappy transmission that was immature. And the transmission on the Panzer III really doesn't come onto its own until about 1941. I would certainly agree with you. If the Panzer III of 1940 had the transmission that it had in 1941-42, it would have been a world beater. It's a well balanced tank design. It has a pretty good gun. There's a lot of things to be said about it. But the problem in 1940 is it had a crappy transmission, so it had fairly bad durability and other issues. Also, it was built in relatively modest numbers for exactly that reason. The German army had hoped to have a lot more Panzer IIIs in service by 1940, and same thing in 1941. But they realized that there was a problem with the transmission, and they didn't push it into service in large numbers until they solved that problem. And so you got to give them some benefit of the doubt in that regards. They realized there was a problem, and they held off building vast numbers of tanks that were just going to break down on the battlefield.
I think that's something that a lot of people don't quite grasp, is that they always complain that the Germans built many, many different types of vehicles. But as near as I can tell, they were willing to give up on a bad law. The only difference was that they wouldn't necessarily declare it to be a bad thing until they tested one or two in the field. Well, let's make 2 Dicker Maxes and we'll send them out and see what happens, which makes the model manufacturers wonderful, millions of dollars selling models of Dicker Maxes. But the Germans didn't know this was a bad idea, or the Panther II, let's not build it, so on.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think part of it is that by the time you get to 1943 and 44, the Germans had really screwed up from the strategic standpoint in not building enough tanks. There were strategic decisions that were made early in the war, and once again, let's blame the right person, Hitler. An awful lot of steel was going into battleships that weren't needed, and aircraft carriers and other crap like that. And the tank program just wasn't given enough priority. And so they're out there on the Russian front. It's like, man, we could use another couple thousand tanks. When you start looking at the number of operational German tanks on the Russian front in 1942 or 1943, it's pathetically small. So there's this big strategic issue. The Germans really screw up early in the war of not building up their tank industry and not building up plants that could mass produce tanks the way that the Soviet Union does and that the United States does. But really, the only 2 countries that are really good at mass production of tanks World War II is the United States and the Soviet Union. Nobody else does it particularly well. Britain doesn't do it. I mean, take a look at the Matilda II. How many different plants built the Matilda II? They built, small numbers, but what was it? 5 plants were building the Matilda II? Whereas, there's 5 plants in the United States building Shermans, but they're building 55,000 of them. And it's the same thing with the Soviet Union. They've got 3 or 4 big plants, but, they're cranking out, 80,000 tanks.
Actually, I don't think you mentioned the M7 medium in this.
That's a national disgrace.
Okay, well,
that's my next worst American tank of World War II. And there's no excuse for it. That was just stupidity all around. The tank itself, I mean, from an engineering standpoint, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just a complete. It's a case study of how to do a program wrong. There's nothing inherently wrong in the design. It's just a whole series of really stupid decisions.
Okay, there's only one question from the field in this. Well, actually, there's 2. One is that a T34 print on the wall behind you? And
yes, it is. And in fact, if you have my old Osprey book in the New Vanguard series called T34, that's the cover art of the centerpiece art. It's the cross-sectional drawing that appears in the center of the book. That's an original Peter Sarson illustration. Back in the day, the artists who do the illustrations for the Osprey books, they received their artwork back from the publisher, and then they could sell them. So if you wanted to buy a piece of artwork that appeared in an Osprey book, you could contact the artist and purchase it. So I purchased a number of the paintings that Peter Sarson did. I also did some uniform books early on that Ron Volstedt did. So I have a number of plates of Soviet Army and Red Army soldiers that were using my books on those subjects that Ron Volstedt did. So yeah, that is in fact an original watercolor.
In Sector 57, did anybody's career get ruined from the M7 screw up?
I don't think so. It's such an embarrassing subject. I haven't looked at it in any depth. I mean, I don't think anybody comes out of this very well, and everybody kind of brushed it under the table. If you look at the official ordnance history, that was done during the war, nobody makes much light of it, and the millions, if not billions of dollars they threw away. They built an entire tank plant to manufacture it. And, aside from handfuls of prototypes, nothing was ever built. So no, I'm not aware of anybody having their head chopped off, or perhaps that person did have their head chopped off and everybody else just hushed up and kept quiet about it.
We're probably getting a bit ahead of this, but before I forget, it is a fair question. Thomas Berman, could the Germans have used the battle need / battle worthiness concept for more bang for the buck? Was battle need, battle worthiness something that was worth emulating?
I don't know that it was, because the German procurement system was screwed up in its own unique ways. If you go to an ideal world and you don't have Adolf Hitler as your supreme leader, and you don't have Ferdinand Porsche kicking around, and you just have Heereswaffenamt. If you had the Heereswaffenamt people, they're pretty much along the same lines as the ordnance people in the United States, and they're engineers. They have a pretty clear idea of what they want to do, and they go and talk to the service people, Heinz Guderian and those folks, and say, well, what do you want? And here's what we're going to offer you. But as soon as you start throwing in all of these outside influences, where, Hitler comes in and says, in 1941, he starts up the Tiger program and the Panther program, and stuff starts going off the rails immediately, because as soon as you start saying, yeah, we're going to build these really, really heavy, really expensive tanks, and at the same time you look out on the Russian front, and sitting in front of Moscow is a couple hundred broken down Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs, and they're starving for any halfway reliable tank. Obviously somebody's strategic vision is skewed in a kind of funny way. And so I don't think the problem with the Germans is battle need, battle worthiness, that engineering compromise. I think it's rather that their procurement and their strategic vision is so screwed up just because of the nature of Nazi Germany. And I think they were screwed in. They were screwed no matter what, because Hitler could just interfere with these. And Hitler loved doing it. Unlike Stalin, who would kind of stick his finger in every now and then, Stalin let the engineers do their stuff. Whereas Hitler did go in and put his finger on the, well, I'll give you an example entirely out of the realm. Why did the Messerschmitt Me-410 stay in production so long? It's a crappy airplane. Adolf Hitler. Why did a lot of these things happen? I mean, Hitler would come up with these crazy ideas, and he had the authority to do something, and he did, and he distorted their procurement process. So, Nicholas, I'm not hearing you.
Oh, yeah, I was just saying, there was this lovely quote from Hillary in Operation Think Tank about how Adolf Hitler was not afraid of technology and designations, which was a bit of a problem.
Yeah. All right, and so he loved the stuff. He loved it, and he loved interfering. He was in a way like Churchill, but Churchill, for whatever reason, had some sensible people around him, and Churchill would actually listen to some of the sensible people around him, whereas Hitler had some sensible people, but he just wouldn't listen to them.
So, actually, an interesting question: would you compare the Canadian Ram and Grizzly production to the M7? Was it wasted effort?
Yes, it was. I mean, I'll get into some arguments with my Canadian friends about that, but the Canadians, part of the problem is that the Canadians have a chip on their shoulder. There's a strong anti-American streak in Canada, and I say that even though half my family is of Canadian origin. So the Canadians tend to look at something and they say, well, the Americans are doing this way. Why don't we go and do it some other way? And of course, Canada also has a strong British influence. So when it came down to the Ram, it was sort of like, yeah, we sort of depend on the Americans for the transmission and the suspension and all that sort of stuff, but we want to go, we don't want to follow the Americans as far as the other stuff, so we'll go to our British brethren and follow, the other course. So they go to the British style of having a more anti-tank type weapon stuck on it, first the 2-pounder and then the 6-pounder, and they end up with a really worthless tank, partly because they choose the 2-pounder at the outset and eventually the 6-pounder, they go with the smaller turret ring. That limits any growth further down the road. And so basically they build lots and lots and lots of Ram tanks, and then finally they say, the hell with this, and they start building Shermans.
All right, so let's hop over to the Russian front. So now we've got Panzer IIIs, Panzer IVs, 38Ts, all expecting to go up against BTs and T26s, and then they meet KVs and T34s. Ooh, big shock. What do you and then of course you also have a couple of pictures of the SMK and the T100, which are silly.
But they're known before the KV and the T34. The interesting thing about SMK is that in T100 is that they see very limited service in Finland, and the Finns actually knock one out. And so the Germans are vaguely aware that the Russians are building stuff other than what's been in the public parades. You know, they know about BTs, they know about T26, know about T35. They don't know about T34 because it doesn't see any service until 1941. But they have some vague idea that the Russians are working on these super heavy tanks because they see one in Finland. The Russians actually demonstrate, or they use a KV in Finland, but there's no imagery of it. The Finns don't capture one; they don't get any photos of it, so they don't know about it from that standpoint.
So
but yeah,
okay, go on.
Yeah, but the big shock in 1941 is the T34 shows up and the KV shows up, and yeah, that is a big shock for the Germans. It shouldn't have been. I mean, go back to 1940. I mean, what happens when the Germans run into the Matilda II? And they run into the Somme, they run into the Sharbie. This is not a big surprise that the other side has tanks that have pretty good guns and pretty good armor. And the Germans really had no excuse to be surprised in 1941. They were probably overconfident. They really thought that the Red Army of 1941 was going to be the Red Army of the Russo-Finnish War, that they were just going to be absolutely horrible, and that they were going to overrun them. And that almost happened. I mean, the Russian army of 1941 was pretty terrible.
Well, I mean, in fairness to the Germans, they did knock out T-34s from day one.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the Russians were down 800 out of 1,000 tanks after the first month.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing that people forget is that, you can have tanks that seem to be invulnerable, but nothing's invulnerable. And so, you run into, for example, one of the most common methods for killing T-34s and KVs is the good old German 105mm field howitzer. Everybody makes this big deal about 88s. But if you go and look at German unit records, what does the infantry division have that can kill those type of tanks? It has 105mm field howitzers. It's got an artillery regiment. It's got 3 battalions of 105mm field howitzers. If you hit a tank, even if you hit it frontally with a 105 HE round, especially from close range, the crew of a T-34 or crew of a KV is really going to be hurting. You may not penetrate the armor, but there's a good chance you're going to do some significant damage. And if you hit it from the side, you can get penetrations. So, so you can't view tank warfare solely on the basis of tank versus tank. There's the bigger mix of, what else out there to kill you.
So why do you give? I mean, commander's choice to the T-34 I can understand, but why would you give tanker's choice to the T-34 and not say KV?
Because the KV is horrible. The KV is unusually horrible in 1941. It has great armor, it has great firepower, but the mobility is awful. It has a just god-awful transmission. And it takes the Russians almost a year to get the transmission up to stuff. And the KV is always a failure. The KV was never a very good tank. The KV is the one. The Germans were impressed with it because the armor and the firepower was good, but the KV was never very good. It wasn't. It was better in 1942 than it was in 1941, but it was still no good.
It's one of the things I always like to say is, when you're the guy shooting at it, you think it's the worst thing in the world, but you don't know the hell that's going on inside the tank that they're facing you with.
Yeah, the KV just had a long history of a very poor powertrain.
I think you make mention of one incident with the T-34. I know I make mention of it as well. It's like the T-34 took 30-something hits before escaping and was undamaged. I would say, yeah, okay, well, that's fair. But the fact that it took 30-something hits and never saw what was shooting it is inherently a problem.
Well, one of the other problems is that's not widely realized. Even though the Russians had these wonderful tanks like T-34 and KV, in some units they had no ammunition for it, or they had limited types of ammunition, because both of these tank types were coming in with new types of tank guns, and the Russians were just on the verge of putting these things in production. There were a lot of Russian units that went into the field with basically machine gun ammunition, or with handfuls of HE rounds and no AP rounds. So the situation with the Russian army in 1941, fortunately, there's a lot being done, but it tends to be being done more on the German side. There's a lot of good new accounts of Barbarossa from the German side, kind of revisionist accounts of the campaign. But there needs to be more stuff from the Russian side, and unfortunately, I don't think we're going to get it because the current Russian viewpoint is to kind of downplay how disastrous 1941 really was. There was some very good Russian writing about this back in the 90s, but the national mood at the moment is not to highlight those early disasters. So I think if you want to see some honest portrayals of the status of the Russian army in 1941, you got to look at the Russian stuff that was being written in the 1990s. There's some really good stuff out there in Russian.
Custom Dioramics. Stephen, got your latest book. Hope to see you at AMPS 2022 in Virginia. Ricky, you claim T-34 was the most produced tank. Are you including both the T-34-76 and the T-34-85, or is this figure just with the T-34-76?
No, it's for T-34 in general. I don't distinguish them. I mean, the T-34, other than the turret, is basically the same tank. I mean, it's the same engine, it's the same hull. There were obviously some changes, but it's the same way with the Sherman. I mean, when you're counting Shermans, are you just counting the ones with the 75, or are you counting, the A2 or the E2 assault tanks, or are you counting 76 millimeter tanks? You can count it different ways, but no, it counts everything. It counts everything.
Yeah. Is the Vickers 6-ton underrated as to importance? Yeah. When this video is over, it'll be available on YouTube, Jeff. We covered the 6-ton reasonably well earlier. Okay, so let's move on then from Barbarossa to Russian Front 1942. And to a large extent, we're talking about the same vehicles. We got the Panzer III now has a long 5 centimeter and a better transmission, which, if I recall, was a pre-select transmission of some sort as well. It was easier to drive. The Panzer IV is starting to get a long gun. The Sturmgeschütz is getting a longer gun. But
1942 is the response to 41. Yeah, I mean, 42 is the response to 41, and it takes two different. It goes in two different ways when you compare the Red Army to the Wehrmacht. In the Wehrmacht case, their first encounters with T-34 and KV are very unfavorable. There's all a tank panic, so the big push there is to get longer guns to deal with the T-34 and get into the KV. So you see the up-armoring and the up-gunning of both the Panzer III and the Panzer IV. You can certainly argue that Panzer IV comes into its prime at this point. They get the L-43 gun, then the L-48 gun. They get some armor improvements. Panzer III finally comes on its own. It gets a better transmission. It gets better guns. The Russians go in the other direction. The Russians halt any improvements to their tanks. This is a big thing. People don't realize it. The Russians were actually going to take the T-34 out of production in 1941 and replace it with something called the T-34M. T-34M is actually the Russian version of the Panzer III. They sort of went back and redesigned the T-34 to take the lessons of the Panzer III to heart, and that included things like a 3-man turret, torsion bar suspension, features like that. But in 1942, the Russians say, no, we're not going to screw around with this stuff. We're not going to do improvements. We're going to stick with the existing KV tank. We're going to stick with the existing T-34. We just want to produce these things in numbers. We lost. The Russians started out the summer campaign in 41 with 24,000 tanks. They lost 22,000 tanks in 1941. So around Moscow, December 1941, they're down to a few hundred tanks. So they say, we got to build lots and lots and lots of tanks. So no improvements. It's a strategic decision. No improvements in the tank force. Just build lots of what we got. They do allow improvements, in the sense of, yeah, the KV's got a crappy transmission. Let's get some improvements there. But they're not allowing any fundamental changes.
I mean, they weren't alone in that either. The reason the British had the 2-pounder for so long, even though the 6-pounder existed, was they couldn't afford to take the time to retool the factories and saying, should we stop making Sherman and build something else? I don't think people realize just how much work goes into changing to a new vehicle. Or
yes.
Let's stop building Panzer IVs and build Panthers.
But it's also the reason, the Russians were already working on an 85 millimeter tank gun at that point. So people say, well, why didn't the Russians have an 85 millimeter tank gun at the time of the Battle of Kursk? It all goes back to this in 1942. They need tanks so badly that they make a strategic decision that they're simply going to go with what they have. And I think that from the commander's perspective, not from the tankers, we get to this tanker's choice versus commander's choice. From tanker's choice, that's a really bad decision. The tanker wants better armor, better guns. But from the commander's decision or from the commander's choice, that was a very wise decision. I mean, you talk to the German tanker at the end of 1942 or 1943, and it's like, well, Ivan has 100 tanks to our 10 tanks. Well, there's a reason that the Red Army has a significant numerical advantage to the Wehrmacht by the end of 1942 and 43, and that's the decision made early in 42 to stick with the existing designs.
So when the Soviets did move their factories from one side to the other, what actually goes into moving a factory? I mean, do you move the casting equipment? Do you just take the welders and the people and the welding equipment, the portable stuff?
They moved the people, the human talent, because they moved the design bureaus. I mean, literally the same people who worked on the T-34 in Kharkov got moved out to Nizhny Tagil and to some of the other plants. And same thing when they moved the heavy tank people from Leningrad out to Chelyabinsk. They moved the people. They moved whatever types of heavy equipment they could move, rolling machines, welding equipment, all that sort of stuff. But the point also to keep in mind is that the Russians were already building these new tank factories even before the move happened. This was not happening into an open field. For example, the people who take up the slack in 1942, as far as T-34 production is concerned, is the Stalingrad tank plant. Well, Stalingrad started producing T-34s in 1941, and at first, what they were doing is they were getting bits and pieces from Kharkov and then just assembling them, but they were starting to produce. So in 1942, they take over the burden of T-34 production, but they're already a facility that's already working in 1941. And then later on, after Stalingrad, of course, the factory falls during the fighting in Stalingrad. By then, there's other plants that are ready to go. There's Nizhny Tagil, there's plants in Omsk, there's other facilities that can pick up the slack.
So you give Top Tank 42 on the Russian front both Tanker's Choice and Commander's Choice to the Mark IV-G with the long gun. I don't think I can argue against that.
It's an excellent tank. The Panzer IV, to begin with, from a mechanical standpoint, is an excellent tank. It's got a good transmission. It's got good suspension. It's got a good engine. By that stage of the war, it's very reliable. It's slightly less reliable than the Stug 3, but still, German tanks go, it's a very reliable tank. That's an excellent weapon. The long 75 on the Panzer IV is a superb weapon. It's very well balanced. It has a good HE round, has a good AP round. It's got the key feature. It's got the 3-man turret. It's got good radios. There's nothing to complain about. Correspondingly, the T-34 at this point in time is starting to decline in quality. Now, you look at it and you say, well, the T-34 of 1942 is the same T-34 as the one from 1941. But the real answer is no, it's not. Because under the industrial conditions of 1942, the quality isn't there anymore. The transmission's not as reliable. The engine's not as reliable. The Russians are cutting corners in order to crank out quantity. So the T-34 of 1942 is nowhere near as durable as the T-34 of 1941. So it's actually slid in quality.
That's true.
Whereas I would argue
you make mention, I think it might be in a later chapter, about the quality control testing. That the Soviets did, and they realized that 9 out of 10 factories were failing.
Yeah, it was terrible. T-34s in 1942 were really sliding in quality, and it shows, and you see it in the unit histories. If you go and look at Russian unit histories, you see, tank corps, mech corps trying to move forward, and seeing how many go from the railhead and reach the battlefield, and how many break down in between, and it's astonishing how few make it up to the front. Or you see combat casualties. Everybody says, oh, the Germans knocked out all these Russian tanks. A lot of the Russian tanks that are lost in 1942 they simply break down the battlefield. Germans stumble into them and pump a couple rounds into them and set them afire. But they were broken down. Their real combat loss is due to mechanical breakdown rather than German firepower.
So again, I'm scanning ahead. You have a table in here somewhere that shows, depending on what hit the T-34, what the percentage of penetrations was. And by the time you get to the mid-length 75, you're looking at 95% of impacts would penetrate the T-34. Yet everybody says the T-34 had wonderful sloping armor and the Sherman was very weak armor. And it's kind of like going, well, if that was the level of protection you were actually getting, it doesn't sound all that impressive.
Everybody has these expressions like, the Ronson and all that other nonsense. If you look at the Russian accounts, the Russians are not a bunch of happy campers. There's a lot of things that aren't understood about the T-34. For example, if you've sat inside a T-34, which I'm sure you've done, that there's the fuel tanks sitting on either side of the turret. They're in the sponson areas over the tracks. And then everybody says, well, they're diesel fuel, so they're not going to burn. But then if you read the Russian accounts, what people don't realize is that when you drain the tanks and you have just diesel vapor in those tanks, and those tanks get penetrated, you get a big stinky kaboom, because it's that vapor that is a deadly combination if you get penetrated. So the T-34 had lots of problems. You see all these pictures, especially from the 1942 period, of T-34s just all blown apart. And one of the problems is the fuel system. You empty those tanks happen to be located in the side, which is fairly likely to get hit. And if you have fumes in there, they tend to be somewhat explosive. And then, of course, you have ammunition backing it up, so you get the double whammy. So, yeah, T-34 in 1942 is not an entirely happy situation. When some product improvements are brought in, things start to happen. But 1942 is kind of a low point for the T-34.
So Rob Cogan just chimed in. He said he was working on the T4 Christie today, and the fuel tanks still freak him out. Have you been to Benning recently? I
haven't been to Benning since they moved all the tanks down there. I don't have an excuse to go down there the way that I had an excuse to go down to Knox or to go to, obviously, over to APG. APG for me, of course, is right in the neighborhood. But it's just the strange thing is I probably visited Russian or French tank museums more often than American ones, because from a business standpoint, I have to go over there more often. And so, when I'm over in France, I'll go to Somme or one of the other tank museums, or when I'm over in Russia, I'll go to one of the tank museums over there. Or if I'm on a business trip over to England, I'll go down to Bovington. So yeah, I've been to Bovington probably. The last time I was in Benning was had to be like 20 years ago. Whereas I've been to Bovington maybe 2 or 3 times in the last 5 years.
I'm sure Rob can probably come up with some excuse for you to visit.
I do want to do it, and I probably would have done so if it wasn't for the pandemic. The pandemic has really changed a lot of my travel plans. So
everybody's. I was going to go down to Brazil to do some filming, and it's kind of like I still have the ticket paid for. Because the Brazilians did some very weird things with some of their tanks, but sadly, no. I got this random phone call from the commander of Army South, like he's a 4-star general. It's kind of like, yeah, I got this phone call from Brazil saying you were coming down to visit. Why is a 4-star general calling me on my cell phone on a Monday evening without warning? But anyway, so you don't spend, reasonably enough, you don't spend much time talking about the Pacific Theater. Because best tank at the Pacific Theater is a pretty easy thing to determine.
Well, I have that chapter called Other Theaters, and that's kind of I had to deal with it. I mean, I had to deal with the Desert Campaign. I had to deal with the Pacific Theater. I didn't want to give them total short shrift, but on the other hand, I'm a number cruncher. I mean, what I do for a living is I look at weapons production numbers and that sort of thing. And so when I'm looking at tanks, and I'm looking at 20,000 tanks in the Russian front and 200 tanks in the Pacific in combat. I don't mean to say total produced. My feeling is you got to go where the numbers are, and the numbers are the Russian front. When things changed in 1944, when the Wehrmacht ships the majority of its tanks west into Normandy, that's a different story. But up until Normandy, there's only one theater, and that's the Russian front, as far as tanks are concerned.
Who was it? Zabish. Yes, if you got a good question, we will address it. You cover North Africa. You got the Semaventa, the M3 medium. Again, I'm not going to say an underrated tank, but it's not as bad as a lot of people make out.
Yeah, it certainly isn't. I mean, for what it was, the British Army, compared to what they had themselves, they were pretty happy with it for a while. I mean, everybody admits. Yeah, it would have been nice if the U.S. right from the outset had built Shermans. I think one of the real great mysteries is why the U.S. didn't go over to Sherman sooner. The time frame there, I have a feeling that it had something to do with machine tools, that the U.S. Army couldn't produce turret races soon enough, and so they stuck with the M3 because they could produce those little turret races for the M3s.
Book states that the original plan was 150 M3s before Sherman production, but the demand from the UK, we need tanks now, meant that they couldn't stop producing. So again, it's just like we were talking earlier about the T34, that you had to.
But they continue. The U.S. continues to build M3s for a fairly long period of time. You would have thought that there would have been a switchover sooner. There's an awful lot of M3s that are built, And you would have thought, but it probably is exactly what we were talking about earlier. If you have the choice of taking what you have on hand now and get lots of them, or wait a few months and get a few better tanks, you probably want to get more. And I think that probably the most important point to emphasize, and it's hard to convince people who play World of Tanks about this, is most tank fighting has nothing to do with tank versus tank. It's the majority of tank actions are tank versus infantry or tanks versus other types of targets. And so when you're dealing with those kind of targets, the M3 medium tank, the Lee Grant, is not a bad tank. When you're shooting at any tank guns or at buildings or at infantry, it's fine. Yeah, if you're fighting against a Panzer IV or against an entrenched 88, maybe it's not wonderful, but it depends on your perspective.
Okay, so on other fronts, you give the tanker's choice again to the Mark IV-G, and you give commander's choice to Sherman. I can see that.
The Sherman at this point in time, we're talking late-ish 42, early-ish 43. Sherman at that point in time is a very, very good tank. Maybe it's not perfect. The gun could have been better. The Panzer IV has an advantage in that the Panzer IV with the long 75 has better tank killing capability than the Sherman. But the Sherman has its other advantages. And that's why I gave it the nod on commander's choice, because it is, by that stage, a very reliable design. It's available in big numbers. So,
well, I mean, one of the things that always gets me is people, they picked the 75 because it had a better high explosive content. Compared to what? If you look at what the tank destroyers were, the American tank destroyers were being fielded an older version of the same gun. It was the best damn gun that the Americans had. Yeah. At least that they could reasonably do. I mean, you got all those 3-inch variants that were useless until the M10. Okay, so let's hop on then. You have a chapter all titled about Tiger Rampant, 1943.
Oh, well, you have to do that. I mean, I already knew the answer to who the best tank was going to be in 1943, whether I wanted to say so or not. I mean, number 43, the Tiger is in a lot of respects a really crappy weapon system. But from a tanker, once again, tanker's choice. If you're a Joe Blow tanker in the summer of 1943, it's an easy answer. It's got to be the Tiger. It's got by far the most lethal weapon on the battlefield. I mean, who else has a gun that compares to the 88 millimeter gun? The Russians don't, not at that stage. I mean, the Russian tanks at that stage are still stuck with the 76 millimeter gun. Now, admittedly, some of the self-propelled guns, the Su-152 and the Su-85 are starting to get bigger guns, but those don't count. Those are not tanks. I'm not counting them in this book. So from a tank standpoint, the Tiger has the most lethal gun on the battlefield. So from a firepower standpoint, terrific. Armor, same thing. It's got wonderful armor. I mean, it's far better than the KV. It's far better than anybody out there. And, mobility, it's got issues. It's got very poor reliability. It's very expensive, so you can't build very many of them. But, if you're a tanker out there, you want to be sitting in the Tiger, not in a T34, not in a Sherman.
So, I got two counters to that. One is, if you're a tank crewman and your tank is broken down, and you are told ahead of time, if your tank is broken down, you are going to the front with a rifle, and you're on the Russian front in the German army, and it's almost like a game of Russian roulette. If my tank is working today, I'm going to be in the safest thing on the battlefield. If my tank is not working, I'm going to be carrying a rifle.
Yeah, but I can give you the immediate answer to that. Every German tanker knows what the answer is. The German tanker knows he's going to be sitting in the pillbox because the Wehrmacht understands that you don't expend tank crews as infantrymen if you can avoid it, because it takes a lot of time and effort to train them. So the average Tiger crewman knows, I don't care if we break down. We're just going to sit there in this big, powerful pillbox and sit there. They know that they're not going to get shipped off as infantry. Now, it's the reverse of the case in the Red Army. The Red Army, well into 1942, if you're basically detanked, your tank breaks down or you get shot out from under you, you're expected to continue to fight, and they will take tankers and stick them into the infantry and send them forward. And then finally, by roughly the summer of 42, the Red Army suddenly realizes, wait a second, we've just spent 6 months training these guys to be good tank crew. We're going expending them as infantry? What sense does this make? And so there is a change in policy in the Red Army in the summer of 42 to stop doing that. But the Germans know better. A German tanker in the summer of 43, he knows if his Tiger breaks down,
Because then you get the other argument is, okay, I'm a German Tiger, I'm in the Tiger II. The German government had just spent all this money on steel for my tank, but it also meant that it didn't spend as much money on the supporting assets like self-propelled artillery and air power and whatever else. So the fact that I'm in this great tank, my life expectancy is actually less because I'm going to get overwhelmed.
Yeah, but that's a far more sophisticated argument that your average tank guy is going to do. The commanders will think that way, but your tanker doesn't think that. He's just thinking, I'm sitting behind 6 inches of armor. I'm a happy camper.
One of the things I regret, I asked Ralph Ratz at Panzer Museum, because we all, there is a figure that says Armored Force lost 1,500 tankers in all of World War II. You add on to that the officers, add on to that the tankers who were branched infantry. I saw a good assessment once, maybe it was actually about 3,000. There isn't such a figure for how many German tankers survived World War II. And I have a suspicion it wasn't many. But
I suspect they had a very high casualty rate. Yeah, on the U.S. side, I do campaign. Besides doing my tank stuff, I also write campaign books. So I have to do a lot of writing on U.S. infantry units. And as soon as you write anything about infantry units in World War II, this whiny stuff about, tankers, they suffer all these casualties. You can't take that with a straight face after you've read anything about infantry combat.
110,000 riflemen from the U.S. Army were killed? Killed, not wounded.
The book I'm working on right now, the hardcover book I'm working on right now, is about the Rangers at Point Du Hoc and Omaha Beach. And one of the Ranger forces, the one that goes in near Strong Point 73, they suffer 50% casualties in the first 5 minutes. 50% casualties in the first 5 minutes. By the end of the day, they've suffered 70% casualties. And both Ranger battalions, 2nd and the 5th, the 5th, which takes relatively light casualties, suffers, I think, 45 or 50% casualties in 3 days of combat. And the 2nd Ranger Battalion suffers 65, 70%. And in reality, it was higher because a lot of the guys were basically walking wounded and they didn't want to stay behind. They had such a esprit de corps that they just wanted to stay with the Rangers. So they didn't consider themselves wounded.
One of the, I make the point often enough, but there's no way of proving how many infantrymen lives were saved by Shermans, because they're facing a machine gun or a pillbox and they can get on the radio and there happens to be a Sherman nearby because there's so many of them, they're so ubiquitous. And the fact that they can't kill a Tiger is completely irrelevant to the infantrymen.
Yeah.
Okay, so we move on.
That's the one thing I would tell people is that the tank versus tank stuff is fun, but to understand tanks, you really do have to look at campaign histories.
So we talk about the Tiger. The Panther gets a brief mention, although in 1943 it's not exactly all that.
The Panther in 1943 is awful. If you look at the reliability rates, I found down in the archives, and someday I'll publish the whole thing. Most of the figures are actually in the book, but there's a wonderful chart. I think it's a Heereswaffenamt chart that shows reliability rates of all the German armored vehicles in 1943-44 on the Eastern Front, and Panther is just terrible. So that's why you don't see Panther there in 1943.
Famous, you're famous. Say hi, Steve. Hi, Steve. Okay, so you got a lovely photograph here of a couple of Tetrarchs, with the Sandsty riding alongside T34s. Goodness, what they were thinking with that one. That was
a training unit. I don't think that those Tetrarchs really saw very much combat. The Russians were desperate for tanks, but not that desperate.
And then you mentioned briefly some of the prototypes, like the KV-13, the T-43. Actually, I didn't know they built a T-43, but there you go.
T-43 was the direction that the Russians were going in if it wasn't for Kursk. The Russians in 1943 finally changed their mind and said, okay, we've held off improving the T-34. What are we going to do to improve the T-34? And they actually said, we're going to take the T-34 and the KV and combine them in one. So basically, they're going to take a T-34 and give it the armor that the KV has. And that's basically what the T-43 is. Plus, they finally started to smarten up about the three-man turret feature, and they started looking in that direction as well. So T-43 was the direction that they would have gone if Kursk hadn't happened. But then they encounter the Panther and the Tiger, and they say, uh-oh, we forgot about that firepower business. And so they can T-43, and they come up with T-34-D5 because they need a better gun.
You do mention the Lend-Lease, so I mean, we know that the M3, however popular it was with the British, not so popular with the Soviets.
And we don't really know that, to be quite honest, because the Russians have never. Most of those stories, Grave for Seven Brothers, all that stuff, that comes from back in the good old commie days when they didn't want to admit that Lend-Lease was the least bit important, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know how honest that is. When you start seeing actual Russian accounts, when you see Russian unit histories where they talk about the vehicles, they're nowhere near that negative. I don't mean to say the Russians thought that the M3 medium was a wonderful tank, but I think that I think there's a heavy propaganda quotient to the sort of the prevailing view of the Russian viewpoint on the vehicle.
Rob points out that the Russians said a Spitfire was a poor fighter. Well, I would counter that with their position on the P-39, because and I think it's just down to altitude. What altitude was the fighting happening? And Spitfire, Battle of Britain was high altitude, and the P-39 was flying around at low altitude.
But where the engagements on the Russian front tended to happen.
Yeah. So Lend-Lease Churchill. So I mean, we know they kind of like the Sherman. I mean, you've got the book by Loza, for example. Which if you haven't read the book, lads, it's a great book, very well translated. It's an easy read. I mean, it's just sample size of 1, so be careful of your conclusions. But it is a good book.
The Russians don't get a lot of Shermans though until 44. For a variety of reasons. There are small numbers of Shermans in service in 43. They really don't have a lot. The Sherman doesn't start showing up in the Red Army in large numbers until 44.
And the Churchill. So we know they liked the engine on the Valentine. Shame about the gun. What was their opinion on Churchill?
They never got very many Churchills, and they really didn't like it. They thought it was too sluggish and too slow. And if you look at the Churchill and the KV, it's basically a case of they looked at the Churchill and said, we've already got a tank like that, the KV. The reason that they were very keen on the Valentine is that their light tanks were awful. The T60 was an awful little tank, and the T70 wasn't much better. So the Valentine, okay, it's not perfect, but the Valentine is a fightable tank. It's pretty durable, and it's certainly a world better than the T70. It's got a bigger crew, so it's easier to deal with. It's got, better layout. It's, so basically part of the problem is that some of this is just politics. They're sitting around at these Lend-Lease accords, and it's kind of like, well, you're going to give us this stuff. What's our menu? What can we choose from? By 1943, the Russians don't have, 1942 is one story, but 1943, they don't have a lot to choose from because Britain's not producing much at that stage. They're producing Valentines and Cromwells, and the Russians don't want Cromwells. And actually, it's not even the British who are producing the Valentines, it's the Canadians.
Actually, you do have a photo of the T50. I always thought the T50 was kind of was more the Panzer III equivalent for the Soviets. Torsion bar, 3-man turret, smallish gun.
Yeah, the T50 was actually their replacement for the T26. The T50 was going to be the new infantry tank, and the reason it didn't succeed is it came in the T34 correspondingly was going to become their BT replacement for the cavalry tank. The reason the T50 didn't succeed is it was very complex to manufacture, and when they switched the plant from Leningrad and they started moving it, they just said, it doesn't have a good enough gun. We'd rather just build more T34s. So, very sophisticated tank, very nice tank, but just too expensive to build and too complicated to build.
All right, so your commander's choice for the 1943 isn't a tank.
And that was kind of my I don't want to say joke. That was my kind of left curveball on 1943. The Stug 3 had to get in there somehow. The Stug 3 is more than just an assault gun. It just played such an important role for the Wehrmacht, especially on the Eastern Front, that it had to get in there. And for all intents and purposes, and the argument, of course, that I make in the book is that the Stug 3 at that point in time is not an assault gun. The Stug 3 is an infantry tank. The Stug 3 is essentially the Wehrmacht's infantry tank. Heinz Guderian didn't want them to build a tank specifically for non-Panzer Division units. And so, Stug 3 became their infantry tank. And so therefore, I define it as an infantry tank, and therefore I can count it as far as top tank. Yeah, and it's cheating, but
No, but it's fair. I mean, again, you come to that question I mentioned earlier about what actually is doctrine, the effect of doctrine on the tank design, because it's not just armor, firepower, gun. It's also how is it going to be used. I mean,
Yes.
you have you written much about the Cold War tanks and equipment?
Strangely enough, I have a new series of 3 books coming out from Osprey. I just saw the galleys. It's called Tanks on the Iron Curtain. I didn't come up with that title, but it's basically Tanks the Cold War. It'll be broken into 3 sections. I finished the first one, which covers 45 to 1960. That's due out, I think, later this year. Then it'll go 60 to 75, and then 75 to the end of the Cold War. The Cold War stuff, the Cold War stuff
is, as I recall, in from the 70s on, the primary anti-tank system of the Red Army was the missile, whereas the Americans still relied upon the tank. So, is it fair to compare a Soviet tank as if it was fighting tanks when the doctrine said that's not the most important thing?
That's actually what I'm going to be writing about in a few months. Getting into when I do the second book in the Cold War series, that's when the missiles really start to have an impact. That's, of course, when the Russians, cancel their heavy tanks. Khrushchev basically comes out and says, no more heavy tanks. It's all got to be missile tanks. So there's this whole period, not very well known in the West, where the Russians are building all these missile-armed tanks. A lot of fun stuff. But that's a future project. I have written it up a bit because I've done Osprey books on the T-55, T-62, and I mentioned those issues. I've covered some U.S. Cold War stuff. I did a book really a long time ago called Modern U.S. Armor. I did it with Jim Loop, and that's kind of a history of U.S. tanks of the 50s, 60s, 70s. But no, I haven't done as much. And you and I were having this discussion some time ago. The business about the National Archives, the stuff on U.S. tank development from the 1950s and 60s still being classified. The strange thing is I have no problem with U.S. tanks from the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. I was in the business at the time. In the late 1970s, I was working for DMS Incorporated. I was covering the armored vehicle business, the business end, who's manufacturing the stuff. And so I have tons of stuff on, M60, M1, Bradley, the whole developments happening at that period of time. But I have a relative gap for the Cold War years because the stuff's still classified.
Jenkins was asking about the T-80 light tank. I just grabbed Barry Atinsky's book off the shelf here. Basically, it says it sucked and they stopped production after 75 vehicles.
Yeah, well, they replaced it with the Su-76. If I was going to make a comparison to the Stug 3, or if I was going to be kind of cute about it, trying to have another alternative, not really in 43, but more in 44, it's the Su-76. It's the second most common Soviet armored vehicle of World War II. T-34 is number 1. Su-76 number 2. And Su-76 from an engineering standpoint is an awful vehicle. It's basically a T-70, T-80 light tank. Take the turret off, stick a 76 millimeter gun in the back, and boom, instant assault gun. But the crew is exposed. It's got an open rear casemate. It's nowhere near as versatile as a Stug 3, but it's a heck of a lot better than nothing, and it's a heck of a lot better than a T-70 or a T-80 light tank. And that's the reason that they can the T-80, because if you have a choice between the T-80 with a little piddly 45 millimeter gun, or you have an Su-76 with a 76 millimeter gun, you're going to build the Su-76. So that's the simple answer. That's why they didn't build the T-80.
Okay, so let's move on then to 44. Probably the most varied and interesting year, because you got anything from working Panthers, T-34 85s, the British come back into the scene with the Cromwells, Shermans get upgraded.
This is the tough year. It's a tough year from the judgment standpoint because, there's new stuff coming online from everybody. So on the German side, you have the King Tiger. I ignored that. It's just available in piddly numbers, and it's not that good anyways. But Panther comes onto its own finally. Everybody yaks, Panther 1943 Battle of Kursk. No, Panther 1943 Kursk is a terrible vehicle. Panther in the summer of 44 is an excellent vehicle. By then, it's the Ausführung A. They've gotten rid of most of the reliability problems. It's got an excellent gun. They've gotten rid of all the other issues. So it's Panther at its peak. And Tiger already gave Tiger the nod for 43. So Tiger's not going to get it whether it's, whatever. And so on the German side, it's obviously going to be between Panther and Tiger, and I already gave the nod to the Tiger 43, so it's going to be Panther in 1944. And then the other contenders, the Sherman with the 76 millimeter gun, and for a variety of reasons I decided against it. So T-34-85. The reason is there's just a load of them. I mean, when the Russians finally do make the switch in early 1944 and start building the 85s in large numbers, they become available in very significant numbers by the summer campaign. You're talking, 5,000 vehicles by the summer, large, significant numbers. There's 2 or 3 T-34-85s for every German tank on the Eastern Front. Plus lots of other regular T-34s, the 76 millimeter T-34. And T-34-85 is a good tank because the other thing that happens besides the new gun is the Russians introduce a quality improvement program in the manufacturing sphere at the end of 1943 where they realize they have a problem and they start trying to get the quality back up to snuff. And they do it with T-34-85. By the summer of 85, the reliability rates are much, much better. They get rid of a lot of their problems. They get rid of the problem, for example, with the engine filter, which had traditionally been a source of problems. They come up with a new transmission, which is better. So the T-34-85 is good, not only because it has the new gun, but it also comes out at a time when the Russians are taking quality control a lot more seriously.
Side question: were Panzer IV and Matilda the only tanks to see service from the start of the war to the end? There's Jono suggests the short-barreled Panzer III with the 75 millimeter. Yes.
The short-barrel 75 Panzer III is not available in the early part of the war. It's what is it, 42? I want to say.
They took it off of the Mark IVs, but what's still in service at the end is the question. That would make the Mark III also a tank that served the entire length of the war.
I will tell you the answer there. They were in Norway. In the German army in Norway and Denmark were equipped almost entirely with Panzer IIIs with short 75s. Mm. So you have to decide whether you want to consider that a combat theater. But yeah, there were a significant number of Panzer IIIs with short 75s in the peripheral theaters.
Right. So we move on to the British, and you actually quote the Chieftain's hatch. I have made it. I have been cited.
Oh, I love that. I love that one that you had because I had never seen that. That whole Operation Vampire and all that stuff evaluating.
I found that one, if I recall, in the archive boxes in Bovington.
Yeah. Well, I'm never been a big fan of Cromwell. I mean, it's not a bad tank. I mean, as British tank goes, if you compare it to, British versus German versus US versus Soviet, I think the Cromwell is one of the British tanks that is pretty much in the even mix against its nearest counterparts. But it's not a Sherman. It's not as good as the Sherman. It's not as good as the Panzer IV. I certainly don't think it's as good as a T-34-85. I actually have one of those British AORG reports. I should look at it and see how they evaluated it against T-34-85. But I think they evaluated the T-34-85 as better than the Cromwell. That's a British assessment. So, and as we were talking about a few moments ago with 44, there's so many choices. So, it wasn't as though it was Cromwell fighting it out with 75 millimeter Sherman. It was really, there were other better things out there to compare because that's the nature of things. If it's the top one, you gotta make a choice.
Toyo-san points out that the Mark IV was still used in the Syria in the 1960s, so the tank must be good. Well, so
there were Shermans down in Chile till what, the 1990s?
I think Paraguay removed their last gun tank in 98, 99.
Yeah, it could be. There's strange holdouts, and you can certainly make the argument with the T-34. You're probably where the Russians are going to have that parade pretty soon. The May Victory Parade, and most of the T-34s there come from, of all places, Laos.
Yeah. Well, did you see them running them in the tank biathlon?
Yeah.
They were running them hard. I mean, credit to them. They were running them hard and shooting a lot.
Yeah, but a lot of those were the Czech-built ones. 1956. That's the thing that I get a kick out of. I saw them on the parade, and you can really tell the Czech one's pretty easy because they have a very distinctive turret casting. And so here it is, Victory Day parade in Moscow. Yeah, and they're running Czech T-34-85s. I know the people out at Kubinka know that, but it's what are you going to do?
Okay, so you give Commander's Choice for 44 to T-34-85 with runner-up to the M4A3. Okay, I can see that. And for Tanker's Choice, you give it Panther. Did you give the IS-2 much thought? Because I would have thought the IS-2 would have an argument as well.
I didn't give it to the IS-2 because the IS-2, first of all, was not available in very large numbers in that campaign. IS-2 starts to become more common in the 1945 campaign. The other thing is the IS-2, most people don't realize it was a true breakthrough tank. It wasn't designed. Everybody looks at it as being sort of like a heavy, like a Tiger 1 equivalent or a King Tiger equivalent. It really wasn't. It was an infantry tank. It was designed to provide fire support for the infantry. It had a very, very slow rate of fire. It had a very limited amount of ammunition. It had only I forget the exact number, but it's like 25 rounds. The one complaint that you see from Soviet units in World War II is it did not have enough ammunition. You couldn't go for a whole day. If you were in a serious day's battle, you ran out of ammunition before the day was over. So it had its problems. I think, it's a good tank, but it wasn't available in the numbers of some of these other tanks. It wasn't as significant in 44. I think it would make a better contender in 45 when it was available in larger numbers. But then it's facing other competitors, so I didn't consider it that seriously in 45.
A total aside, the IS-2 and the Collings Foundation right now, the gunners and loaders seats are almost on a sort of a teeter-totter around a common pivot. Do you have any idea what that's about?
I haven't been inside their IS-2. They asked me, when they got it in, they sent me some of the serial number information. That's a very early IS-2. It's got the early style front hull castings. Next time I'm up there, I'll have to ask them and try to get inside of it. I have not been inside of it. All the IS-2s I've been inside of have been the later production ones with the later style nose casting. And in fact, the last one that I was in was the, I think it was the Duxford Collection one, which was one of those 1970s Soviet rebuilds that had all the new radios like the R123 radio. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure what that has there. I'll have to take a look next time I'm up there.
VT view from the turret. At the end of the day, was Schertzen worth it? Well, yeah, I'd say so. I mean, those 14.5s in Afghanistan. We were coming across 14.5s like nothing in Afghanistan 10 years ago. So you can imagine how many of the damn things were out there in 1943.
Well, and that's what people forget about. The Russians never develop an equivalent of the Panzer Faust or the bazooka, but they keep the 14.5s in widespread service. I mean, we're talking in the tens of thousands. So yeah, they were a hazard, right up through 1945. In fact, I did a book for Osprey a couple of years ago on anti-tank rifles, and it's the Russian anti-tank rifles only enter service in late 1941. When you think of anti-tank rifles, the heyday of the anti-tank rifle is late 1930s. The Russians don't introduce them until late 41, and then they produce just bajillions.
But that also, I mean, it was interesting. So if you look at the development for Panther that was created before the 14.5s came out, and then they realized, hang on, these 14.5s are out here. Maybe the Panther is vulnerable. Let's build Panther 2.
Right.
Oh, hang on. Schertzen works. Never mind. We don't need Panther 2 anymore.
Cancel that. Yeah, it's a lot cheaper to just hang some Schertzen off the side. Yep, definitely. But people forget that. It's still a common misconception that Schertzen is intended to deal with the bazooka and the Piat and all that kind of stuff, and it's certainly not. It's purely aimed at Russian anti-tank rifles.
A big question: would you rate better the Firefly or the Sherman 76? Because the British love the Firefly. I'm a 76 fan.
I'm really not a US 76 millimeter fan until 45, and you'll see that in 45 I give Commander's Choice to the M4A38, and the reason I do then is that it has the HVAP ammunition by then. So when you're talking the Sherman 76, you have to talk about when and what ammo it has. Certainly, if you're talking Normandy 1944, meaning June, August, I would certainly give it to the Firefly. In fact, my latest book out, it just came out this month, is Allied Armor in Normandy. And so it doesn't have a section called Best Allied Tank in Normandy, but if somebody said, what's the best Allied tank in Normandy, hands down, it's the Sherman Firefly. I wouldn't even consider the Sherman with a 76 to be competitive because at that stage they don't have the HVAP ammunition for it.
Oh, yes, but again, what are you shooting at? I mean, if you're shooting at two still, you'd rather have the 76 than the Firefly.
Yeah, well, then that's true. But I think that yeah, but then it comes down to, yeah, but what happens when you do run up against a Panther, that sort of thing. So I don't know. I mean, I did give the nod to the M4A388 with HVAP ammunition in the 45 top tank for commanders, because once it gets HVAP, it's a lot better.
I always found it a bit interesting that, I mean, the Ordnance Branch were more than willing to develop new equipment. And they had been talking about HVAP, looking at the archives, they'd been talking about the HVAP concept for quite some time. Yet for some reason, they never built even an experimental prototype until June or July of 44. And that's something I have never figured out why they didn't do that. Not enter mass production, okay, they had the Intel failure. That I can understand. But not even designing it is something I've never seen. I'm
gonna give you my theory, and it's kind of more philosophy than anything hard and fast. The problem that I see that our ordnance had, as compared to U.S. Army and ordnance, as compared to the technical development branches of, say, the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Navy, is that ordnance traditionally developed weapons that did not fight other weapons. If you look at what ordnance developed, it developed small arms and artillery. And who do you shoot with artillery and small arms? You shoot people. And so the target over time doesn't change. Whereas, the Air Force and the Navy, right from day one, they're always fighting another machine. The Air Force, you're fighting other fighter planes, and Navy, you're fighting other warships. And so ordnance had this instinctive tendency not to think of machine versus machine warfare. The first time they have a weapon system, which is machine versus machine, is the tank, but it isn't even that right away. Look at what they're developing in the 1930s. They're not thinking of, the light tank or the cavalry car as being a tank versus tank type weapon. It's infantry support, it's cavalry support. So ordnance comes into the machine versus machine fighting mentality very late. And so they're not geared up, for example, for the tech intel thing. If you're doing machine versus machine, if you talk to an Air Force guy, they're very interested as to what the Germans are building, what the Japanese are building in the way of competitive fighters. Ordnance is not that interested in enemy tanks. It took somebody like J.B. Jarrett to convince them that they had to pay more attention to that. And he was kind of a one-man band. If it wasn't J.B. Jarrett going out there and policing up German tanks in the desert, when he was liaison officer with the British, ordnance here in Aberdeen Proving Ground would have had no idea what the Germans were doing. It was just J.B. Jarrett out there by himself saying, send back these tanks to Aberdeen to show these people what the Germans are doing. So I think there was a real gap. It was a philosophical shortcoming in ordnance that they didn't understand machine versus machine fighting.
We're down to not much. We're down to less than 10 minutes, unfortunately, because the dinosaur has a plan for us. I note that the one guy on the stream who actually has a Panther II says he still loves the tank. Show off. Okay, so Jake actually had, this is a complete side. What was the purpose of the Sherman Calliope, or putting any sort of rocket on a tank instead of just putting it on a Studebaker or a CCKW like a normal army would do it? I don't have an answer to that.
There's the one answer is that the original intention, not only the Calliope, but the T40, the whiz bang, the 4.5 inch rocket versus the 7.2 inch rocket versus the 4.5 inch rocket. Those were originally intended, if you go back and look at it, those were intended as basically obstacle clearing tanks for D-Day. The first tests were in April, May 1944, and they were basically being offered to U.S. tank battalions as an equivalent of the British AVRE. The idea being that to penetrate anti-tank walls on D-Day or that sort of thing, that's what you were going to use them for. They weren't really intended, at least at the outset, as artillery weapons. They were intended more as sort of like an armored engineer vehicle type thing. And then I think that all that happened is it was just sheer inertia. They had small numbers of tanks fitted with these, and somebody said, well, this looks like a great idea, go and try them. The whiz bangs are only used down in the Italian theater. There's only like one battalion that gets them. There's a lot more Calliopes that go up into Northwest Europe, and everybody hates them and tries to dump them as soon as they can. I have found the after-action reports from the various tank battalions that got those things, and they hated them. And it was for two reasons. Number one, they said, what are we doing with these? These are artillery weapons. What's a tank battalion doing with what's an artillery weapon? And then they were also saying, who the hell wants to be driving around with all of this high explosives sitting up on top of the tank? And it's like, it's a really, 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 really bad idea. Tankers are sensitive to the fact that, they're running around with tons of pounds of high explosives sitting over their head with no armor protection. So it was a failed idea. No, at least from the armor force standpoint, they hated it. It was a no-go right from the get-go.
Deinonychus, I don't pronounce it that way either. Calliope versus Calliope versus Calliope. I have no idea. I'll look it up later.
Or Calliope.
Oh, that works too. It's like carbine.
Calliope.
It's a small rifle, a carbine, a carbine, or a carbine.
Yeah, that's. We can debate that all night.
Yeah, unfortunately, I debated that with Gun Jesus and I lost. If you don't know Ian McCallum,
I do. I do. I watch his show. Yep.
Okay, so towards the end now, top tanks of 45. You give Tanker's Choice to Pershing.
Yeah, wonderful. One of my favorites. I'm completely biased. I confess. I think Pershing's a great tank. I mean, it's wonderful, wonderful. Well, by then the Panther sucks for a variety of reasons. Panther gets into another one of its downturns, and it's largely because guess what happens when you have slave labor building your tanks? So reliability goes to crap, and it doesn't get any improvements. It's still a good tank. I don't mean to suggest that Panther OSG is a bad tank, but if you go and start looking at the reports out of the Ardennes of the number of tanks breaking down, and you go and look at some of the restorers who've gone and seen obvious signs of sabotage within fuel lines and stuff like that, you suddenly start to realize, okay, I can sort of understand what's going on there. And so then the other German contenders, obviously King Tiger, that's not going to run. And then on the Russian side, we were talking a little while ago about IS-2. I think the Pershing's a much better balanced design. The IS-2 once again has too little ammunition, very slow rate of fire. Ferocious gun. I mean, the 122 on the IS-2 is a heck of a thing, especially when you're shooting at soft targets. Yeah. So on the Russian side, T-30 45, they already gave that a nod, in 44. So what else out there is really all that competitive? You can maybe make an argument, maybe for Comet, but I wouldn't go that far. I think the 90.
I was not pleased. I'm presuming you haven't been inside Comet.
I've never been inside one, but I've watched
I would not like to fight Comet.
Right? Yeah. The Pershing is a nice modern design. Yeah, its engine could have been better. But it's a nice modern design. It's got the gun is an excellent gun. The fire controls are good. It's got good mobility. Even though the engine isn't as powerful as it might have been, it's still got good mobility. It's got reasonably good armor. It's got good ammunition.
Tim Walding is T26E3, not E1. The E1 was not battle worthy. But he wants to know, is there any history outside of the discussion of the Super Pershing from Belton Cooper's book? Is there any other source on the T26E4?
I'm not sure if he's asking for developmental stuff or combat.
I think combat.
I did an Osprey called, I think, Pershing versus Tiger, and I put out everything that I have been able to find about the Super Pershing, and I might add that I spent a small fortune buying up an eBay collection of Super Pershing photos. So you'll find some of the only actual combat Super Pershing shots in that book. So if you are interested in Super Pershing, take a look at that book, because it does, and it also explains why I think the Pershing was an excellent tank.
Speaking of T-series tanks, if we were to consider that the M7 was a national embarrassment, how about the T-23 that they built 250 of the bloody things?
Yeah, but at least out of T-23 they got the M26. They got the T-20. Yeah, they got the turret outfit for the 76mm Sherman, and also they eventually got the Pershing out of it. Whereas the M7 doesn't go anywhere. I mean, what benefit? You don't get like an M7A5 that cured the problems. You don't get anything. It's a pure dead end. Whereas T-23 you can argue is a failure, yes, but it does it does have continued evolution.
And you give Commander's Choice to the Sherman. I mean, one of my best examples of why the Sherman is so good is the Bridge of Remagen. where
Yeah.
the bridge could be repaired within 8 hours and a Sherman could get across, and the Pershings
Right.
had to wait 3 days. Can you
Right.
imagine being the guys on the other side waiting for a tank and
Yeah.
being told,
Yeah.
no, we got the best tank in the world, but it's on the wrong side of the bridge?
And that's why the engineers didn't like the T26E3. You know, if you go back and you look at the reports, and the engineer board didn't want to accept the T26E3 because they didn't have any bridging to take care of it. It was too wide. It was not only too heavy, it was too wide.
Was it your book that said the Treadway Bridge? Or it may have been a different book. Said the Treadway Bridge, the improved one, was never shipped to theater in time.
Yeah, I don't think it was shipped to theater because when they wanted to get the T26E3s across the Rhine, what they basically had to do is kind of jerry rig up a couple of pontoons and stuff, and it was all strictly jerry rigged. Then of course they got regular real bridges up, and then then it was fine.
Okay, I'm about to start getting pings now from the dinosaurs saying that we've run out of time. I've no doubt. So it's quick admin notes. Tank winners: Oil Burner, Thumper E23, and Mighty Barbarian. And Deinonychus, or whatever, the dinosaur guy. I wonder if that's a rig there, Dino. Gets the book. So congratulations. Hopefully you don't have it already. If you do, feel free to sell it on to somebody else or donate it to your local library, I guess. Let's see. So when we do a raid, we are raiding one of the casters for our cash prize 15 versus 15 tournament, sponsored by Simply Nook. So watch out for that. Just hang on once the stream closes, and we will kick you over that way. Steve, we have run out of time. That was a lot of fun. I'm sure we can talk many, many, many more hours. In the future, pick a different book, maybe one of the Cold War books. I like Cold War. I
think it's real interesting.
World War II, but I really like Cold War.
There's a lot of interesting stuff, and it's not very well covered. There's not a lot of books out there on it. So,
all right. So, right. I guess I will just have to make an appointment to meet you in Fort Benning. I'll be there at the end of May.
Maybe I will. I don't know what I'm doing. It's kind of hard to predict with the pandemic. So. We'll see.
If you got your shots already, then
I do. I've had both my shots, so I'm cool.
You're better than me. I get mine on Monday, and this is Moderna, so I'm probably going to be out on Tuesday.
I had Moderna. I got Moderna rather than Pfizer, and I had no issues with it. First shot or second shot.
Really? Yeah, you're one of the few folks that my dad was out.
Younger people. I know some people who got Moderna, and they did have issues. But as far as I was concerned, I had no issues. Now I regularly get the other shots, so maybe that has something to do with it.
All right, and Frederick Christensen must be a Canadian because he says he's going to overlook your comments about the RAM. Well, I mean, it is right. I mean, what did it get out of it? An APC, I guess. Right, that is that. I hope you all enjoyed the show, and keep an eye out on the World of Tanks channel for the next Cavs meeting. Thank you, Steve. And everybody, have a good night.
Decks for action.